The world is changing so fast that we can't even grasp. I was trying to look some statistics up to see some ways that we can see how things are changing. And one of the statistics I came across was data. The data that's out there, the information in the internet, has increased from 9 zettabytes in 2013 to 120 zettabytes in 2023. And I had no idea what a zettabyte was. I had to go look that up. It's 1 trillion megabytes. It's hard to wrap our minds around it. I thought, well, that's too hard to understand. How about the number of devices that are hooked up to the internet? So that would be smartphones and computers. The number of internet-connected devices has doubled since 2019. 4 years. It's doubled. And I thought, wow, that's still too hard for me. Let's get down to books, books. And each year, somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million new books come out. And I thought, well, why can't they get it a little closer to that? And the problem is that now you're able to self-publish. And in reality, if you count all the self-published books, the count reaches close to 4 million new books every year. So if you feel like you're falling behind in your reading, you really are, okay? With all of these changes and all of these new things, there is something that doesn't change. In fact, there's 2 things that don't change. One is the pattern of sin, and 2 is God's grace. They don't change. We're going to start a series now on the life of Gideon, and Gideon is found in, if you want to open your Bibles to Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8. And just so you could have the setting of it, Bible Project is an organization in Portland, Oregon, that makes videos that introduce books. And I thought it would be helpful for you to grasp the beginning by watching a short video. So can we have the video now?
The book of Judges. So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant with God by obeying the commands of the Torah. And if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes were all governed by these judges. Now, don't think of a courtroom. These were regional, political, military leaders, more like a tribal chieftain. And you need to be warned, the book of Judges is very disturbing and violent. It tells the tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, of its bad leadership, and basically how they become no different than the Canaanites. But this sad story is also meant to generate hope for the future, and you can see this in how the book's designed. There's a large introduction that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. Then the large main section of the book has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges, and the progression here shows how Israel's leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad to worse. The concluding section is really disturbing and shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So let's dive in, and we can explore each part a bit more. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. Chapter 2 describes how Israel just moved in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. This part of Israel's history, the narrator says, was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. This cycle provides the literary design and flow for the next main section of the book. It gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges whose stories are told here. Now, the stories of the first 3 judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judge themselves or people who help the judge, they defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer, and they focus in on the character flaws of the judges, which get increasingly worse. So Gideon, he begins pretty well. He's a coward of a man, but he eventually comes to trust that God can save Israel through him. And so he defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying torches and clay pots. But Gideon has a nasty temper, and he...
Stop it at that point. Thank you. You can go to Bible Project and look at the rest of it if you want to. I just wanted you to get up to the point of Gideon and realize that this is the situation that is going on. Not only did this happen once, but it happened over and over and over again. As he says, if you read the Judges chapter 1, you will see that again and again it mentions that they failed to drive out the people. They failed to drive out the people. But it's actually Judges 2 and verse 10 that really sets the stage. And let me read that for you. After that generation died, another generation grew up who did not acknowledge the Lord or remember the mighty things that he had done. You see, God's power was seen so clearly in the deliverance of people out of Egypt that even those people, because of doubt, wandered for 40 years in the desert, and the older generations were all died off. And then Joshua led the people in, and the walls of Jericho came down, and the miracles of overcoming were all around them. But they got comfortable too soon, and they did not finish what God had wanted them to do. And that's the situation that we come to. And it's not happens once, as the video pointed out very clearly. It happened over and over and over again. And when you turn to Judges 6, you'll see that we're in the 4th cycle already. And I want to read the first 10 verses. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, marauders from the Midian and Amalek and the people of the east would attack Israel, camping in the land and destroying crops as far away as Gaza. They left the Israelites with nothing to eat, taking all the sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These enemy hordes, coming in with their livestock and tents, were as thick as locusts. They arrived on droves of camels, too numerous to count, and they stayed until the land was stripped bare, so Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. When they cried out to the Lord because of Midian, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites. He said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of slavery of Egypt. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you. I drove out your enemies and gave you their land. I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites, and in whose land you now live. But you have not listened." That's where I'm going to stop today. But you have not listened. I want to look at this passage. You can keep your passage open there, and just section by section quickly today. First of all, in verse 1, it just says simply, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They turned back to worshiping false idols. And all the time, for 7 years, they thought the problem was the Midianites. And I can imagine every year they prayed to themselves, oh, keep those Midianites out of here and we'd be okay if we just had that taken care of. And the problem is that was their view. They thought difficulties were caused by circumstances, by nature, or by anyone or anything except themselves. And isn't that very human? Go back to Genesis, to Adam and Eve. And after they had sinned and the Lord came, and Adam had this great idea. He gave an excuse. Lord, it's because of this woman you gave me. Not only did he indict women, but he indicted the Lord. It was the Lord that brought her. Of course, she was equal to the task. She said, well, it's not my fault. It's that serpent. He led us astray. And we have not changed that pattern, have we? So often when we are caught in troubled times or caught in sin, we say, well, it's somebody else's fault. It's not my fault. God views troubles quite differently. He sees difficulties as opportunities for us to seek him. He allows them into our life. I don't think God causes all the trouble in our life, but he allows them into our lives to open our eyes and to see him and to see what is real. C.S. Lewis says it this way: God whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Then look at verses 2 through 6, or the first part of 6 there, and you'll see the devastating effects of sin. There was shame. They hid themselves. Now, maybe that was fear and shame, but they were hiding themselves. There was servitude. They were completely controlled by others. Sin seems to take over and control lives. They were driven by fear. And ultimately, there was starvation. They were sowing, but there was no reaping. They were working hard, but had nothing to show for it. At the end, they were empty. Sin in our lives leads to these same things: shame, addiction. We become servants of the things that we think will make us happy. If I just had more money, if I just had more of this or less of that, I could be happy. Addictions to those things, fear, and ultimately emptiness. Without God, lives are empty. Then in 6b, verse 6, B, it says, then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. It was their last resort. Isn't that just like we are sometimes? We want to get everything taken care of ourselves. Just as they tried to overcome in their own strength, we're like that. And when we can't seem to find anything that helps, then we go to prayer. Shouldn't be that way, should it? We should go to prayer first. But the wonderful thing about this is that the call for help is always heard. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7, it was the time when Israel had become slaves in Egypt. And God was speaking to Moses. And God said to him, go down to Egypt and deliver my people, for I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and I've heard their cries of distress because of the harsh slave drivers. Yes, I'm aware of their suffering. When Moses went down, that was the thing that affected them the most. It was the fact that God had heard them and God knew what was coming on. In fact, the Bible tells us nothing's hidden from him. Psalm 56:8 says, you keep track of all my sorrows. You collect all my tears in your bottle. You've recorded each one in your book. Now, I know there's happy tears and sad tears. My wife sheds a lot of tears when she's happy. But there's also times that we shed tears when we're sad. And we especially shed tears when our children are sad or hurting. And it says here that God collects them. Now, I know that this is poetic language. He doesn't have a bottle for everybody. But he's aware of every tear that you've cried. He's aware of every time you cry out to him. He knows that. But look at the amazing fact. The amazing fact is that God responded with grace despite their sin. And that's for us too. God responds in grace despite how long we've rejected him, despite how long we've ignored his word, despite whatever we have done. I think Satan loves to whisper in our ears, God doesn't love you anymore because look what you did. Despite all that we've done, God hears us and he comes to us and reaches out to us. What grace! It's not based because you're good enough for God to love you. You aren't. Neither am I. We don't deserve it. Look at verses 7 through 9. Deliverance begins with revelation. I'm really convinced of that. It's not in every one of the cycles that as clearly as it is in the cycle of Gideon. They wanted a warrior. They were praying, God, bring us someone strong to break the rule of these Midianites. And God sent them a preacher instead. It had to be a little bit disappointing. I think some of them thought, actually, we were looking for somebody with a sword. But they needed to hear from God first. We sometimes, when we pray, we want immediate results. And sometimes we need to step back and listen, what is God's plan? We need to understand what God's doing in our lives, particularly in those times that are hard, particularly in times when there's difficulties. But I want you to hear what the prophet said to them in verses, we'll start with verse 7. He says this, I rescued you. This is God, the God of Israel says, I brought you out. I have to go back to 6. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, I brought you up out of slavery. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from those who oppressed you. I drove out the enemies and gave you the land. I told you, I am your God. Isn't that an amazing thing? He is saying this, God is saying this to a people who have turned their back on him and have rejected him and are worshiping other things. And he reminds them, he's still their God. I know some people will say, well, but that was Israel. Go over to Galatians and you'll find out who true Israel is. It's believers. We are the sons of Abraham. If you have put your faith in Jesus Christ, you are a child of Abraham. And God is so personal with us. He says to you and to me, I am your God. I am your God. Just think of how God has lowered himself and said, I'm your God. You're my people. What an amazing thing. He reminded them of his love, and then he reminded them of his power. At the time Israel were enslaved in Egypt, Egypt was the powerhouse of the world. They were undefeated in that era. No one dared come against Egypt. But God did, and God broke them and delivered the people out. There is no power on earth that can hold you when you cry out to God and God reaches down and lifts you up. There's no power that can do that. The descent, though, is always the same. Those words echoed, I'm sure, in their hearts, but you have not listened to me. What an indictment. I did all those wonderful things for you, but you have not listened to me. It begins with failure to give thanks and to acknowledge God. If you go over to Romans chapter 1, you'll see that spiral down away from God. But it begins in verse 21. It says this, yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. And as a result, their minds became dark and confused. Now, I know when children are little, we teach them to say thank you because it's a proper thing. It's polite. And, when somebody gives something, you say, what do you say? You say, thank you. Right. I think sometimes God needs to reach out to us and say, hey, what do you say? When you realize that you are not thankful for the things that God has placed into your life, and you're critical and you're complaining, you're on the wrong path. You're spiraling down. They knew that God was there, but they refused to acknowledge him or even give thanks. I pray, when I pray for you and when I pray for my family, I pray that God would give you a thankful heart, because that is when you've acknowledged him. Now, real quickly, just the lessons that we need to learn from this first part. We're gonna get into Gideon. We're gonna spend 6 weeks with him. It's no secret that I love Gideon. We have the Gideon's men. Gideon has always been one of my heroes, and you'll